Welcome to the Hunting Beast Podcast, your source for hunting tactics, news, and stories. And now your host, Mario Traficante.
All right, Joe. Well, it's been a long time since we've got one of these going. So I'm happy to be back. I'm happy to be back at it. It's been a busy fall and busy winter time, and now obviously we're all locked down for a while here.
Yeah, everybody's got some free time.
Exactly. Well, all right. So I think we got some good topics to discuss today. I wanted to kind of focus on different terrain features as well as setups that you used for your season last year. Many of the people that are probably listening might have followed you and followed along with your season last year when you traveled around out of state to two different locations and had some success on two different bucks in state. So I thought it'd be good if we started with your buck that you shot in the early season in your home state here in Wisconsin. If you want to give us a little bit of background maybe on that buck, if we could focus on some terrain features and things like that of each of the areas and how it differs, I think it'll make for a good discussion.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So with that buck, what kind of happened, I'll backpedal a little bit. I always take vacation the first week of bow hunting just because the deer they're hit with such little amount of pressure at that point that they're still kind of on their summer patterns if you get the right deer in the right areas. Obviously, some deer have been pressured at that point already quite a bit from people pre-scouting. But so I take the first week of vacation off of the season, and I had been pounding around the swamps I was actually looking for the deer that I ended up shooting with the muzzleloader here in Wisconsin. And I wasn't doing very well in the swamps, and I remember scrolling through the Wisconsin Rut Report, and everybody was killing everything over food sources, alfalfa, beans, corn, that sort of thing, acorns. Obviously, there's less people that hunt swamps in the Rut Report than what, So anyways, I kind of switched gears and started hunting more of the farm country, and I worked out to a bean field where I knew there were some deer hanging out. I didn't know of anything big specifically in that area, nothing huge, but I knew there were some good ones in that area just from glassing in the summer. And what it was in this situation is it was a bean field that butted up to a sorghum field, and there was an apple tree kind of between the two fields. And the apple tree was dropping really hard, and I was kind of almost using the apple tree as a bait pile.
Okay.
And so I went past, the apple tree was still out in the open. It wasn't secluded, so I knew nothing would be getting to the apple tree till dark. So I worked down to a little wood lot that was, I would say, 150 yards from the apple tree. And there was a sorghum, and it's hard to, obviously, you almost have to watch the video for me to be able to explain it very well, the layout of it. But there was a sorghum and the beans, and I was basically right where they met up and ran into a woods. And I was going to catch anything working through the beans and up to the apple tree. And then actually when I got down there, I noticed a faint little trail coming through the sorghum from a tiny little wood lot on the other side of the sorghum. The wood lot's kind of part of a drainage ditch. But anyways, I noticed a faint little trail there, so I set up so that I could shoot that trail. It was about a 30-yard shot. And what ended up happening was on the other end of the bean field, a buck came out with a bunch of does. And it was like a 120-inch buck. He was decent. And the does came by me first, and I knew right away that they were going to win me. And I knew they would win me and take him back with, and that would kind of be the end of it. And that was exactly what happened. They took him back in the cover, and it was probably still 20 minutes till closing time. And this is where I screwed up. I decided I was going to get down right away and get out of there before. I figured they ran in the woods a little ways far enough that I was hoping they couldn't see out in the field, so I would get out of there without them seeing me, and then I'd make a move on them for either the morning or the next night.
Right.
And I slung my tree stand down around out of the tree, and there was a loud clank. And the moment it clanked, something in that sorghum went tearing off. And I remember pulling up the binoculars and seeing the buck that I ended up shooting tearing off back into little tiny hardwoods. And because of that, he was a little bit nicer, I think, than the other one, the other buck that I had initially saw earlier. And in that situation, I've got a lot of past experience with that bedding area that he came out of. I knew it really well. You hear people talk about bump and dump, and I didn't bump him out of the bedding area. I just bumped him out of the food source and knew he was coming out of the bedding area. So in terms of bump and dump, I knew it would work really well because it's not like it wasn't like a hard bump, you know.
So, yeah, that makes sense. So the faint trail that you set up on in the woodlot, that was in between the beans and the sorghum, and they were coming from a bedding area, entering the beans, and then crossing that trail to get into the sorghum. But your wind was such that they had to cross your wind to get into the sorghum, is what you're saying.
Not quite. So how can I explain it better? Imagine a fence line with no trees on it.
Mm-hmm.
And the apple tree was in the middle of the fence line. There's a hardwoods at the end of one fence line, and that fence line divides a bean field and a sorghum field. And on the other side of the sorghum field is this bedding area where this buck that I ended up killing came out of. So the deer that were coming out into the field on the other side of the beans had a potential to wind me if I could have shot the does that winded me. So if it had been a buck, I'd been fine.
Right.
I was working with the best I had to work with at that point in that
Got it.
situation with the wind. But the deer, anything that would come from that sorghum out of the smaller woods where I ended up killing, there was no way they were going to smell me. I was good.
And they would be traveling eventually crossing over to get to that apple tree, but it wouldn't be till late. So that's why you set up where you did. Okay.
Yep. And in that sorghum, there's actually a low spot, almost like a little valley. And what he did was he worked from the woods that he was bedded in and stayed really low. And from where I would glass, I could never see that spot. So that was kind of interesting to me. It was just a little low spot that you couldn't see.
And that's where he was located, right? So you think he was out in that sorghum field in that low spot because you never saw him, and when you got down and clanked your stand is when you saw him run off after he got out of that low spot, pretty much.
Well, yeah, he came from the hardwoods and used the low spot for travel.
Got it.
In the sorghum.
So when you bumped him, I guess if I'm understanding it correctly, you think you bumped him back to the bedding area that he originally came from, or was
exactly.
That? Okay, got it.
Yep.
Got it.
I'm trying to think. Dan had one of I think it was the Farm Country DVD. There's a video I have of we were actually sitting on the snowmobile videoing a buck laying in a bed, and then I got some trail cam pictures over that same exact bed, and then I ended up killing a buck. He had like a split G2 and a split G3 out of that bed with a muzzle loader that I snuck up on. That was the same exact bed.
So explain a little bit, because I know you've obviously hunted some of this property before. What's been interesting to me, and this on an aside, is just how deer follow the same patterns year after year in traveling from bedding to food. And I know that's not always the case, but on certain properties, they tend to just continue to do the same thing. And this might be a little bit of a weird example, but I've noticed they're doing construction behind my house. So for the last 10 years, I've observed this woodlot, and it's about 40 acres. And I've observed how this family of doe, and every once in a while there'll be a buck that beds up there, but they bed up on elevation. And there's the same quarter of the woods that they'll walk down and traverse this 40 acres and feed. And there's like really 3 spots that they feed in. And then they make their way up to the top side of the 40 acres and they kind of disperse out throughout the subdivision. Well, now about 20 of that 40 acres was clear cut, and they're now building houses back there. Now, even with all that disruption, the deer still bed in the same areas. And I realize this is a little bit different situation because these doe are pretty used to human traffic because there was walking trails back there. But they still travel on the same 3 predominant travel corridors, even though 20 acres of the woods is gone. And it was even more apparent this spring when the snowfall was there because I could actually see the trails coming down off the hill, and they were just beat down paths because at some points there's as many as 18 deer back there that'll come walking off the hill. So I'm curious, I guess, why I brought that up is because in this situation, do you feel like how these deer travel out of bedding in this one spot that you described how that buck used that low spot. Do you feel year over year that you'll see the same pattern in how they move out of bedding and traverse the terrain, or is it more sporadic, you think?
In that specific spot, I would say I've seen a little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's come down to figuring out how to kill in that spot. It's very difficult to kill in that spot. And I think this is the first archery buck I've ever killed in that spot, and there's been many good deer there. And you can't get close to it. I mean, and that's key too. You can't get close to it at night without them picking you off, smelling you, visually seeing you. And that's probably what makes it so key. But I guess obviously the best way to beat them is to get in there as early as possible and beat them back and have your wind blowing away from them.
Right.
But,
so I understand what you're saying. Is the biggest challenge with getting to them at night, you talked about that they can see you or they'll smell you. Is the predominant wind kind of working not in your favor for an evening hunt, or is it thermals, or what do you think has affected you most on trying to go in on an evening hunt?
In that specific spot, I've seen them on every wind use that spot. So I would almost have to say it's more so their eyeballs.
Okay.
They can peg you with their eyeballs. No matter how you access it, they're one step ahead of you. And in the early season, they just don't move far. And there's not a lot of trees around there. You see that a lot too. Those spots don't get hunted real hard where there's no trees. And I would say that's kind of it.
So it's a tricky spot to access due to just vantage point and what they're able to see when you're walking in.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. All right. So the buck busts out, runs back to bedding. So what's going through your mind at that point?
A lot of swear words. I feel like I've blown it, but then obviously you chill out, start thinking about it. And I think I actually texted you that night because I think you texted me about what you saw that night. You were on something. And I'm like, yeah, I just blew one out. And I was like, I'm going to kill him in the morning. And so I looked at the phone, and the wind was going to be perfect because, again, I know right where they bed in that woods. The wind was going to be blowing out from where they bed out over some corn. And I didn't know exactly how they were traveling to get back into the woods. I should call it a point. I didn't know exactly how they were traveling to get into this point. There are a number of ways that they could be doing it, but the wind that I had for the morning would put me within 30 yards of the bed, and my wind would be going out over some corn. And you always hear about deer jay-hooking into their beds, and I didn't see the way it's laid out. I didn't see a buck walking crossways through a bunch of tight rows of corn just a jay-hook. It would almost seem more dangerous for a buck to do that than to come in any other way. So I felt like I could get away with that. So what I ended up doing, I got up really, really early, 3:30 I believe it was, and from the road I walked straight down. I parked my car actually a long ways down the road. I probably walked down the road for a half mile just because I didn't know where the deer were or what they were doing. I didn't want them to hear slamming doors or whatever.
Right.
But then I walked quite a ways down the road, cut down into the corn, and it's probably, I'd say a 300-400 yard walk through the corn, down the rows of the corn, and straight to the tree that I would be setting up. And then I didn't have a tree picked out. I just, from knowing it, I kind of took a shot in the dark at a tree and set up as high as possible because I wanted my wind to get up and over that corn. I was afraid that if I was too low, and I don't know how wind works perfectly, but I just, in my head, I pictured if I was too low, any little weird swirl could drop my scent down into where they're bedded. So I got as high as possible, and as I was finishing setting up, I think I was attaching my camera arm or something like that. I could hear one sneeze right below me, and there's hacking or coughing or something like that. And we had pretty good moonlight that night. And I remember looking down below me in the binoculars, and I could see him standing there. And I could, the night before when he ran away, I could see he's some pretty tall brow tines is what made him kind of unique. And I could see those tall brow tines, and he'd flopped over and laid down right in front of me, 15 yards away. And what was crazy about that was one thing that I didn't put in the video at the time, because I didn't know what would happen. The main bed was actually 30 yards from me. It wasn't 15 yards from me like where he laid. And after he laid down, I could hear another deer in the dark go lay down in the main bed. But I felt like I knew all the deer in that area really well. And I didn't know of anything substantially bigger. And I thought it was a pretty cool situation that I had in front of me. So I was going to wait for it to get light, check the bed over there, make sure what was over there wasn't bigger. And then if it wasn't, I was going to shoot this one in front of me. Well, when it got light, I probably didn't wait for it to get light enough to get a really good look or whatever. But when it got light, I looked over. I couldn't see the buck laying in the other bed, so I thought maybe he kept walking, whatever. And when I ended up shooting the buck that was below me, the one that was in the main bed that was 30 yards away jumped up, and he was a hog. He was a buck I'd never seen before. So if I'd been patient, what I've seen in those bedding areas in the morning, if I'd been patient, I believe that other buck would eventually stood up and kind of adjusted, moved. All he would have had to have done was stand up, and I could have shot him where he was. But either way, I was happy with the way it worked out. I ended up shooting the one that was in the video right below me. He was actually, I guess you could call him more of your satellite bedding buck.
Right.
And, yeah.
So let's back up a little bit. So you decided you needed to get out there early. So for people that are listening, how early are we talking?
Oh boy! So I remember I got up at 3:30. I was set up. The platform of my tree stand was hung over an hour before dark, an hour before light. And I still feel that wasn't early enough because as I was setting up, he came in. Because it's private property, what I'm actually going to do this year is throw some tree pegs in the best tree right there. That way I can climb up it really fast, throw the stand up, and be set quicker. But over an hour, in a situation like that, you don't want to be set up over an hour. I mean, boy, if you're after, say, there's been booners in that spot, and say there was a booner in that spot, I'd be in there 2 hours before light personally.
And so people understand, I mean, you're getting in early because you want to try to beat that buck back to it laying down in its bed for the following day. Right. And that's what you're focusing on. So,
yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your approach. I mean, once you got into the area and you're getting in to access the tree that you're going to set up on, I mean, are you taking a step every minute, every 30 seconds? I mean, how did you go in and approach it to keep quiet enough so you wouldn't alarm any deer? Did you have a clear sky or was it overcast? Did you have any wind that could sort of help you out on your way in?
Yeah, there actually, I remember now, there was good wind, good noise. If you watch back in the video, that definitely helped. I was as quiet as I could be going down corner rows. I wouldn't say that I was overly quiet because it's not like he was hurt. You know, like at night, they're already laying there and you're creeping in. Here, you're hoping that they're 200 yards off. And especially when things are really green, noise does not travel as well in the woods as people think, in my opinion. So I wouldn't say I was crazy quiet. It was more important to me to be set up quickly than it was to be quiet because, boy, if you're not set up quickly and they're coming in on you, it's too late. I guess I was just counting on them not being too close. But I was still careful, right?
All right. So,
yeah.
So you get set up. What about wind? What was the wind doing when you first got set up, and were there any factors? I suppose the height that you got up, how do you think that helped you? What were the thermals doing? Did you check any of that when you got up in the tree?
So I didn't check any of that because I knew it's such open country in this area that I felt like the prevailing wind, or what the weatherman said it was going to be, is what it was going to be, and that was exactly what happened. That's another, I guess, thermals. Another thing I like about the thermals and morning hunting so much is that you get those thermals rising. It depends upon what time they're rising, but we've all had those situations night hunting where you get the thermals sucking right down into them, and then they go bugging out of there. You can get away with being tight on them like that in the morning, whereas at night it's a little bit more tricky. So I guess that's almost an advantage. And so I guess that's how the wind was just very consistent. It was, I mean, I felt like I could have sat there. It was something I played back in my mind after that big one got away. That was bedded 30 yards away. I could have sat there all day, and I don't think my wind ever would have hit him. I think I would have been good.
Yeah. So that's really a key situation where you understood like what side of the bedding you had to hunt on. Was there an opportunity for you to hunt on the other side of the bedding where they accessed from?
No, if I thought about that a million times over. If I had, because all these trees actually that are in this tip, almost every single tree is that ash, and all the ash borers got them.
Yep.
So I think I've got a limited amount of time to hunt this bedding area, and if all the trees ever tip over, there is one tree on the other side of the bedding area that would put them within range. But then I'm cutting, and that's a key too, something for people to think about. I'm cutting across there's basically one of three ways he could have come in there. The deer could have come in there, and I would basically be cutting across one of those trails to get to this other tree. And in the future, that might be something I have to do anyway. I might have to just hope the deer don't come in from that way. But that's key too, to never, especially in the morning like that, you walk across the trail and then he cuts your track below you in the dark 15, 20 minutes later. I think that would freak them out, and I don't think they would bed down. So that's important too, to never walk across where they're going to walk through a few minutes later.
Yeah, so don't walk across their bedding access trail or make a move. You want to try to plan it out where you're on the other side, downwind side of where they're going to bed.
Yeah.
Makes sense. All right, so you can pretty much, I mean, you sum that up to knowing that piece of property, obviously, and the night before getting on the deer itself, bumping it, and then knowing exactly how to hunt that bedding area. So if you were giving advice to someone else who had hunted a bedding area or started understanding a bedding area year after year, I guess this could be a good argument for why people should really study a bedding area or start to learn it year after year to understand how deer move in and out of it, because it could help you in the event a situation like this comes up, you know how those deer are using it.
Right. And what I would say too is don't get frustrated trying to learn it, because I mean this spot is a spot I've hunted since I was 12, and many of the newer spots that I've started hunting in the morning, I screw up a lot of times, and there's a lot of times where those deer, I mean, there's been a handful of deer, two of them I can think of in my head, that came in, they had me nailed, and both of them actually, they bought me time. They stood in the dark trying to figure out what was going on, and I was actually able to shoot both of them. Once it was legal, I was able to shoot both of them, legal light. So, I mean, don't get frustrated with it. They're going to peg you off. They're going to nail you. You're going to screw up, but you'll start to pick up on those things. I would never expect even myself to be able to figure it out in just 1 year how a bedding area is used in the morning. It's tricky, for sure.
Yeah. It makes me think of early on when I was hunting and before I learned a lot of some of these tactics where I just plain wasn't giving myself enough time in the morning to get set up and ready to truly hunt over a bedding scenario, you know?
Yep.
You were more hunting. Go ahead.
Oh, no. So I guess the thing that I just thought of too, with when you said you were newer and you kind of had a preconceived notion of what it was all about. One thing I thought, I'll fast forward and then bounce back. One thing I thought was kind of interesting when I was in Ohio, the buck I shot and a different buck that I shot at, both of them walked down the trails that I walked in on, and neither of them could care less. And I believe that both in my area and in your area, if you had that happen, that buck would never make it to you. So it's, you hear these different stories and what to expect, and a lot of it is based off of what you're hunting, you know. So if you're watching the Outdoor Channel, what they're experiencing in their state is very possibly not going to be what you're experiencing in your state.
Yeah. So to that point, you get it done in Wisconsin early. So now you've got an opportunity to travel out of state and go to Michigan for the Public Land Challenge. So you'd done this last year, or I guess 2 years ago now in Minnesota. What is your process for preparing? And I know you've talked about this before, but what are the things that you're really keying in on when you're going on an out-of-state trip?
Yep. So a lot of this, I mean, I can't take credit for. I have to give Dan all the credit in the world, because traveling out of state, I've done a little bit of traveling out of state, but I've never really been able to crack the code, so to speak, until I learned from Dan. But what it really started with was reaching out to people to figure out where the deer were in that part of the state, where we could get onto deer and whatnot. So, like if you look at just Michigan, we got some advice on 2 completely different areas. One of them was a big, I guess you could call it a big, huge state park. A gentleman told us that his buddy was able to go into that park and shoot a 100-inch buck with his bow every year. And that sounded pretty good to us. If a person was able to do that, we felt like we could get onto them. And another area was what Dan and I were used to, which was that swampy, cattail terrain. It was actually those, what do they call them, phragmites it ended up being. We couldn't tell that from the map. But nonetheless, the deer were kind of using it the same as, your traditional swamp. So what ended up happening, we banged around in that swamp a little bit. That was kind of tricky. And then we went to the state park, and when the state park is huge, I don't know how many thousand acres it was. The big thing that stuck out to us on the map was there was this huge ridge, and the ridge went down into a point. And that point is what really caught our attention, jumped out on the map. So that was where we headed. So we started scouting through all that.
Now that point extended out into the phragmites or into the lowland area?
Yep. So in that particular area, that area wasn't the swamp. That point extended out. There's actually a river on each side of this ridge.
Okay.
So that point kind of extended out into the river. And in that particular situation, the river flooded. So it pushed all the deer out of the bottoms and actually up into this point. Now there's a huge crop field actually. How would I explain it? Down the complete opposite direction of the point, there's a crop field. And the first day we were out there, we were scouting through that crop field. And in the middle of the day, there were a handful of does out feeding in the field. There was some beans. And there were a handful of deer feeding out in the field. So we thought, why overcomplicate it? Let's start by hunting the field, right? So we hunted the field the first night. I don't remember if it was the first night or second night, but there was that decent 2.5-year-old buck that came out. Dan was on the other side of the field, and he saw, I think, one of the bigger bucks back there. I think it was like a 130-inch buck. But nonetheless, it was a good buck for Michigan. So we started bouncing around that field, kind of playing the game, trying to figure out how to get a crack at one of these, and the pressure started ramping up real quick.
So those bucks that you saw in the field, because that, I mean, obviously from the videos, we all recall how much flooding was going on in that river bottom. Where do you think those deer were bedding? I mean, were they all bedding just elevated up on that point? So you guys weren't going into the area of the point, or were you? I mean, where do you think they were bedding in proximity to the river and the highland versus the field?
It seemed like there were some other people out there that were killing deer, and then where we ended up killing the deer, they weren't up on the point, but they were a little ways. I mean, you gotta remember, it's a ridge that goes back to a point. They were anywhere that was thick, anywhere that had kind of that high stem count, they were stuffing themselves into for a little bit of security.
Okay.
Because when we ended up shooting the deer, we were just off that night in the video when we shot the deer. We were just inside of the woods. We had figured out where they were kind of coming up out of a bowl and into the field. So we were just inside of the woods, and that particular area where we were, it was very open hardwoods. And then you saw that guy come in. He walked right through where the deer were supposed to come to. And when we headed back, it was just very open woods. It was somewhere I would not anticipate a deer wanting to bed down. As we worked back to this main point that we had been looking at all week, it started to get really thick. And you could one thing that's in the video that I always kind of wanted to explain better is when we looked up ahead of us, you could see that there were no large trees, but you could see a lot of foliage down below. So we knew it was really thick because you got the sunlight getting to the ground and making it thick. And that's exactly what it was. That was the bedding area that all these deer were coming out of night after night. They were traveling quite a ways through the open hardwoods, but I believe that's where they were. The beds were pounded in that particular area.
So from in proximity to where you guys set up, where you could see that that thick area where the underbrush had grown up, was it up on elevation compared to you, or was it down in kind of a lower focal point? Like, what did the terrain look like? Was it a little bit hilly where you were, or was it flat timber?
It was fairly flat timber at that point. It was such a gradual. You picture a ridge that's real steep on each side that drops down, on your left and your right that drops down, and you keep walking that ridge, and that ridge eventually tapers and kind of becomes flat and brushy, but then goes to a point.
I got it.
That's what it was like.
So that slow taper down on there, that's when you started getting that underbrush that grew up a lot, and that's where the concentration of beds and deer were on there.
Exactly. Yep.
So really the elevated water, the land feature that you guys were able to hone in on was really a narrowing of that ridge and that whole body of high ground into the smallest kind of possible concentrated area. And then to add to that, you had some thick underbrush that had grown up because of the sunlight having access to that area.
Exactly. Yep. And
cool.
That's one thing. I guess I'm stealing the word high stem count from Justin Wright. I've talked to him quite a bit, and he hunts a lot of the hill country in Missouri. And that's what he always explains. You got to look for those areas where it's just real thick, high stem count. I mean, like you and I, we know what to look for in the swamps, but when you get into that hill country or that open hardwoods, you're kind of getting into a little bit thicker of stuff. I mean, that's not to say you have that buck that's bedding out in the open, watching the whole woods or something like that, but
yeah, it definitely helps.
Yeah, when you're just running into a new area trying to figure things out, it's a great starting point.
It's interesting. There's a couple I've seen in hill country, and I don't know if this is typical of just how the topography grows, but I've seen on the wayward side of the hills, like there'll be that thicker underbrush, and then on the leeward side, I've seen bigger timber. I'm thinking of one particular spot on public land that I noticed that because when I came up it would have been the north tip of the point. There was a good parallel trail that ran, right on the top of the ridge and then a little bit at 2/3 elevation. And there were some rubs that went in there, but on the wayward side, it was much thicker. Like it was all tangled sumac and other trees that were up on top of there. And then the oaks were on the leeward side, which was just sort of interesting that that's how it laid out. But you could see the corridors going in and out of that thick stuff where there were beds in there. I've never hunted that spot. It was on public. Because normally the spots surrounding there, I had just hunted the marsh. But it was during gun season when the weather was windy and blowing some rain, so I just was walking the area to try to check some stuff out. But it sounded very similar to what you just described, the way that ridge laid out.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I really, if I told you I was a great hill country hunter, that would be a lie. That's interesting hearing that from you because to kind of hear how they use that, that's a whole tricks.
The difficult part is in walking through there, like I could see, so that particular spot when the ridge came up on the high point of the south end of the ridge, it spilled out into a field, like a CRP field, right? And it probably changed elevation on the north end of it by 500, 600 feet in elevation. But and that trail clearly ran all along the top of the ridge. And on the leeward side, there were you could see where there were plenty of oaks on that leeward side where a lot of browse and feeding was taking place. And there was a couple of trails that were perpendicular that came up over the ridge and then into the thicket on the wayward side. I don't know, it'd be really tricky to hunt because...
That CRP that you talked about, is that higher ground than the ridge, or is it lower, or what's that like?
So right when the trail spilled out into the CRP is at the same level, but then it dips down about the same amount of elevation as the ridge does on the other side, about, gradually dips down about 500 feet in elevation. And then it hits another section of timber, and then there's more CRP behind there.
Do they bed out in that CRP? Have you ever gone through it, or?
I've never gone through it at a time to bump them out of there when they've been bedding. So it was just an interesting spot. I know Dan knows where the spot is. I'm sure it might get a lot of pressure and walking traffic, but there was, from an early season perspective, there's a lot of oaks in there from a food source. It would just be an interesting spot to hunt because there was so much thick on the wayward side of those hills that I'd have to think that something would come up from the north or the south end, traverse that trail that parallels the ridge, and then break off and bed, along that wayward side where it's thicker.
Yeah.
And there was definitely old generational rubs in there to prove that it, either during the rut it'd been active or stuff had been bedding in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting.
Oh. So did you guys, when you, for the most part, other than identifying the large land feature of the point, you didn't know that thicker underbrush was going to be at the end of that tip. It was just, that was kind of like a land feature that presented itself once you guys got in there.
Exactly. Yeah, we had no idea, and then we just knew that deer were coming from that direction every night, and we didn't know how far back they were, and because we had gotten bumped by those other guys, we kind of went for broke, and as we got back there, we bumped up one deer, didn't see what it was, and it was getting thicker, and it made a lot of sense in that way.
So that's a good point that you made. You said you bumped one deer, and then it made a lot of sense. When did you know that you needed to stop and set up and not go any further?
So I was, that specific night, if you watch the video, I was a little low and tight, and I was going to bulldoze probably another 20 or 30 yards, and Jake kind of tapped me on the shoulder. He's like, hey, if we just bumped that deer, we should slow down, and he was exactly right. That was a satellite deer of some sort, and we had probably gone another, 20 or 30 yards beyond that satellite deer. And we realized that where we were, we had a trail on each side of us, about 20 yards on each side of us, and it just, at that point, we didn't want to go any further, and it was a good decision because I think it was like 5 or 10 minutes later, we looked over and he was standing there. So we set up probably with that deer being, he had to have been within 50 yards of us, maybe a fuzz more when we did set up on him.
So you guys using your binoculars in the timber as you're walking through those areas to kind of see if you're coming up on those thicker spots, or were you using mapping like on your phones to understand how you were located in proximity to getting closer to the point?
Yeah, that we were, because if we go too far, then we would get to the end of the point and get to the water, and it would be just pointless at that point.
Yeah, got it. Cool. So tell us a little bit about the hunt. So you guys get set up. What happens at that point?
Yeah, so we got all set up, and I remember saying to Jake, or saying to the camera, as early as some of those deer were getting out to the field super early, and for those deer to have gotten out, I remember saying in the video, so if I say a distance right now, it might be a completely different number, but I'm just going off memory. It was, I feel like it was a quarter mile from this bedding area out to the field. So I knew that for anything to get out to the field as early as they were, they had to have been up on their feet pretty darn early in this bedding area. So I remember turning to the camera and telling Jake that if there's something moving in there, it could be very soon at any time. And when the camera started recording, I remember the sun was still on my face. And in so many instances at home, it seems like prime time hits the moment that sun gets behind the tree line, the moment the sun sets. But I remember the sun was high in the sky, and I looked over, and I had that gray sweatshirt on, and my bright white arms were shining, and I remember reaching over and pulling my sleeves down because I had my sleeves up. That way my arms weren't so bright because the sun was shining on them. But they were up moving early, feeding, munched on acorns. And I remember he kind of kept looping around the bedding area to different acorn trees, and I kept thinking, man, if he decides to go back into where he came from and loop out of here a different way, we're kind of screwed. So I remember telling Jake that we got to take whatever opportunity this thing's going to give us. And when I shot him, I think it was like 32 yards. I would have loved for him to have come closer at like 20 yards or something, but you really have to capitalize on the opportunity when you've got it,
So did you guys have, in that situation, did you have a crosswind that was coming across the point kind of where you were at, or was it coming straight out of bedding, or how was the wind working in your favor?
If I remember correctly, it was straight out of bedding. It was pretty perfect.
Nice. That was a good situation for walking back into that location as well.
Yes. Yep. And the nice thing too, sometimes you get that crosswind where it's kind of blowing across one trail, and you have to shoot the deer before it hits your wind. The crummy thing about that always is if you get that doe that comes out of bedding, or you get that small buck that comes out of bedding first and hits your set and goes tearing back in, you have to kind of set up for those two. Sometimes you can get tight to those trails and get higher than heck and get the wind out over them. But that's something you have to be mindful as well.
Yeah. That's an interesting hunt, though, because lately we've been hunting so many swamps and lowland areas and marshes that the the thought of getting in an area that's big timber like that, but finding a thicket of undergrowth or brush to hunt, but you're effectively hunting it in the same way. If the topography narrows down and it gets to a thick area, much like you've got small trees or red brush out in cattails, but it's kind of the same concept is happening. Instead of a sea of cattails, you've got open timber that's between you and the bedding. So it is interesting how they draw parallels to the different types of topography.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So you guys get it done there. Had to drag the deer out quite a ways back and through some water.
Yep. Now, I guess one thing I'll add that was kind of interesting, the way we drug that deer out down a different trail. That trail was flooded. I think the water was like a little bit over our knees or something like that. But we had to, if you watch the video, you can kind of see we go uphill and then back down into the water. On the other side of the point, the terrain looks the same, but on the other side of the point is where the trail comes up from the other way. This is not the way we accessed, but it was a trail that was flooded shut. And we had one more night of hunting. We went back in there with Dan and Jake cameraman, went a little bit deeper than where I shot my buck, and I went on the other side of the point. And the moment I got across the trail, the main access trail, I bumped the deer, and it sounded like a big deer. He took off, and it was the way he was bedded. It was very smart. And one of the locals sent some trail cam pictures of the bigger buck that was in that area, and I sent it to Dan, and Dan's like, "Yep, that's the one I saw out in the field." And Tim was there, our media guy, and he's like, "Yep, I'm pretty sure that's the big one I saw out in the field." And to this day, I still wonder if that's the one I bumped, but it made a lot of sense because this deer was laying where he could hear any normal person come up that trail, up the main trail, and if anybody cut in towards him, he was going to boogie out kind of into the river bottoms, I guess you could say. So I think the big mature boy had it all figured out in there, and I just pushed a little too far on him the last night.
So that's a good point. So do you think, is it as simple, and I don't want to make it sound as simple, but is it as simple as you just wouldn't have pushed as far in to hunt him? Or what other things would you have to do to hunt that specific deer if you felt that he'd be bedding in those two areas? Like where you bumped him the first time you went in and where he was bumped the second time?
Well, I only bumped him the one time. Am I explaining it wrong?
Yeah, no, I get it now because you didn't know the first time you guys went in, that was probably a different deer and not him.
Oh, yeah. Yep. That we talked about that first deer that we bumped and then I shot mine. Is that what you're thinking about?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm thinking that was because the buck I shot had a little buck with him. There was a doe and a fawn in there. So, and the way it was bedded, it wasn't really bedded like you'd see a big buck bed. So I think it was some younger animal. But then on the very other side of the point, it was kind of untouched. It was an untouched area that had been unpressured at this point in the season. The main access trail that usually gets used every year that wasn't getting used because it was flooded. I came at that trail from a weird direction. It's probably why I'm so confused in the way I explain it. But this other buck was assumably a buck. I didn't see him, but it sure made a lot of sense that it was a buck and the way he sounded and everything. He was bedded right off of this main access trail, watching, listening, smelling all the deer, all the humans coming up this trail. In that situation, I told some of the locals were asking me about it after we left, and I said I would step off that trail 20 yards, creep up a tree super slow. I wouldn't get too high and get picked off. But that deer was bedding, that other deer in there is bedding off of a main access trail where all the people are walking through. He's paying attention to the people.
Yep, that's interesting. Which we've talked about before on a lot of public property where some of the more mature deer will do that. They'll watch the access trail of people coming in.
Yep.
All right. Well, cool. So you get that one done, but you're not satisfied.
Well, it was your idea, right? To go to Ohio, or whose idea was that, Dan?
Yeah, I think Dan first started talking about it. Then I was, I wanted to try to make it happen, and I knew things were just going to get busy with work and the family. But I tell you what, this year we're gonna have to make it happen. We're all locked
Yeah.
inside here for so long, you know. If
Yep.
anything, we gotta. So if you go again, Joe, you gotta twist my arm, and I will go with you. I'll make it happen.
All right.
So
Sounds good.
let's talk about Ohio. Obviously, you mentioned this a little bit earlier with the terrain being different. It's not like we haven't hunted hill country here, but it's not the predominant terrain that we see in the southeastern or southern part of the state here.
Yep.
So how did you approach going about hunting out in Ohio?
Yep. So I ended up going by myself, and a gentleman, Chris, I'm not even going to say his last name because I'll butcher it, but Chris from Elite Outdoors reached out to me. He's like, hey, if you ever come down here and go hunting, hit me up. So I kind of hit him up just to get a feel for the area, what it was all about. And he suggested I look at some stuff that was pretty close to town. I mean, it was really close to town. And I got in there the first morning, checked out some of those areas really close to town, and I had never hunted anything like that. And I wasn't seeing the bedding, and I was rut hunting, so that was kind of messing with my head a little bit because these deer are cruising, and I just wasn't, I'm kind of looking for bedding and stuff like that. I almost had to switch gears a little bit and think a little bit different than I had all season. And so I hit a few properties. I didn't like the way they looked. And then there was another property on the map, that I had picked out. I think that was like a 45-minute drive. I drove out there, and I realized it was the first day of pheasant season, and people were just hammering this property. So then I drove down to where I was actually kind of neat because it was actually, there's a lot of private, it's just flat land, just flat, huge fields, and then these 15 and 20-acre woodlots. I left that area, drove like an hour, and I was in hill country. It was, what do they call it? It's the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And it was some aggressive hill country, not like we see in western Wisconsin. It was very aggressive. And I got down into there, and I think I spent the whole day scouting, trying to remember the sequence of events, but I spent the whole day scouting, and I wasn't seeing squat for deer sign. And what actually tricked me was they had a huge rain, so all the tracks were kind of washed away, and all of the rain pulled a lot of the leaves off the trees, so it covered everything. So there was no sign on the ground. And
So
I'm like, there are no... Oh, go ahead.
So when you were on your scouting, focusing in on your scouting, specifically
Mm-hmm.
around the sign, what types of things in that terrain were you looking for? I mean, obviously you're looking for tracks, but I think how are you traversing the terrain? If you've got this big unknown area that you're going to, I mean, what specifically were you focusing on as you walked the terrain? Like certain elevation points, or was there, I guess, how did you approach it more specifically? And then not only looking for signs, but what other other than tracks type of sign were you looking for, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. During the rut like that, I'd like to bump a big group of does personally.
Okay.
I did that in western Wisconsin that one year. I just kept hitting stuff until I started bumping does, and then I would set up right where all the does were, and I killed deer that way. But even out there, it was crazy because I was hitting in the hill country and even in the stuff near town. I was going through all this stuff, and I wasn't blowing deer out. I wasn't bumping them, and I just felt like there were no deer there. And I remember messaging Chris. I'm like, "You guys really kill deer out here?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "You just gotta stick with it." And that night, I'm trying to remember, but I think that night I ended up going back to town, and he's like, sit up against this one person's backyard. He's like, it was a pretty big backyard. It was like a field. It was like a, what do you call it, a CRP grass.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, sit up against it. And I'm like, okay, whatever. I'm just going to burn my night sit here. And sure enough, here came a 2.5-year-old buck out of the CRP grass and went cruising right through these people's backyards. So that was kind of a little boost in confidence. And I remember texting him at that point. I'm like, why am I not seeing any sign or tracks? I'm like, what is the deal? He's like, dude, it just rained here for like 3 days or something like that. So then I was like, I kind of had to reevaluate everything because
Right.
there was zero sign, it was 100% covered.
So you weren't seeing any fresh scrapes or any rut activity or anything like that because it was all covered up. Yep.
Exactly. Yep. So then I just couldn't wrap my head around the tiny stuff near town. So I went back out to the hill country, and I remember Chris, he's like, I would suggest taking a look at this one ridge. And I figured it had been something that he had hunted before. And I remember after everything was all said and done, and I ran into a big one in there. He's like, "No, I've never actually stepped foot up there in my life. I just figured it might be good." Yeah, and I kind of laughed because I thought he had experience up there. But I went up into this area. It was a heck of a hike. I remember getting in there, losing cell phone reception, so that was kind of eerie because I was by myself. All I had was my car. I didn't take a truck or anything like that. In a situation like that, you get stuck or something, or whatever. It'd be nice to have a truck, but
So
I just had my car.
well,
Yep.
we can is that the location where you might have got your car stuck?
Yeah. Yep. So I think I'll kind of lead into that. So I went up into those hills, and I spent, I think that was the second day. I spent the entire day just cruising all these ridge tops. And on the ridge tops, I started getting into some big rubs and some big scrapes.
So what kind of change in elevation are you seeing in these ridge tops versus what we would walk in like western Wisconsin?
Oh, I'd have to look at the map again. I would, like that place that you, I, and Dan went to that one time.
Yeah.
I would say it's like double that high.
It's double that high. Yeah.
Does 1,500 feet sound right?
Yeah,
I want to say that's what it's set on the map.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and they have these, I don't know what they're called. I guess I'd call them like prickly thorn plants or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Where we don't have them around here, but you can't really walk everywhere because these things they like snag on your legs. It's like a bunch of vines and ropes, and they're prickly. And it actually, I figured out that it actually kind of funnels the deer where they walk. You can see where the trails are because they're walking where these things aren't, it almost seems. But I started running the ridge tops, and I put quite a few miles on the ridge tops, and it was a warm day, so I hunted a little bit closer to the vehicle that night. And I had, I don't know, a few 1.5-year-old bucks, maybe a 2.5-year-old buck cruise. I was up on a ridge. They cruised pretty low below me at last light. So then that kind of told me these deer were bedding down in the bottoms in this particular area because that's kind of where they're coming up out of. And I remember this part's kind of important. I adjusted the deer were all cruising at 40 yards. So I don't want to shoot 40 yards, but I adjusted my pin to 40 yards just in case the situation happened where I had to shoot 40 yards. And,
so when you saw them cruising, sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
But when they were cruising, so what proximity did you set up off the top of the ridge? And I guess what was the wind doing, and what elevation do you think they were cruising at? Were they cruising on that 2/3, or was it at 50% of the elevation? Or go ahead.
No, I would say they were 2/3. That's about right. And then every once in a while, I could kind of see in the distance, they're kind of like these little saddles. They would cut over the top of the ridges. I was right on top of the ridge, so that anything that was on top of the ridge, I was still high enough in the tree that they wouldn't be, I wasn't right in their peripheral vision or whatever. I wanted to get, still high enough. I guess, does that answer that?
Yep, that does. No, it makes sense.
Yeah. So anyways, that night.
Now, were you trying to get, I got one more question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
When you set up relatively were you fading more towards the leeward side or the wayward side, or could you shoot to both sides of the ridge, or how did you play that part of it?
It was a pretty skinny ridge top. I could shoot the whole ridge top, anything, but I think I could have shot on both sides of the ridges if I remember correctly. And I just sat on, I was more so throwing it wasn't a real educated setup. I was more so just throwing a sit at a spot. It was a knob actually right there with some signs, some scrapes. So that's why I ended up there. Now that I think about it, I'm trying to remember some of this back. But I just kept my wind blowing out over. There's like a bowl behind me, and even though there were actually, that's where the deer were actually coming out of. And I don't know if my wind was going over them. I remember the one buck kind of smelled something and got a little bit edgy, but it wasn't a real genius setup or anything like that. I was kind of throwing a sit to try and figure out what was going on.
What was going on? Yeah. Yep. Totally makes sense. Okay.
Yep. So then, what I think, now I'm going to make myself sound like a weakling, but what ended up happening, I
don't
did
think
so
so,
much
Joe.
scouting that day. Well, never mind. I'll keep going. But I did so much scouting that day, so much walking. I didn't drink enough water, and I started getting one of these pounding migraines where, like, even my own flashlight, when I was walking out that night with my stand on my back, even my own flashlight was making my head hurt.
Sure.
And I remember getting down to the car, and I sat down in the car, and I'm like, thank God, I'm finally done with that. It took that abuse. And I backed up, and I remember just feeling the rear end of the car drop down into this ditch, and I looked, and I got out, and I looked, and my front tire was in the air. My one front tire was in the air because the back tire was in this ditch so far, and there's nobody around. There's no cell reception. My freaking head's pounding, and I'm like, Jesus, now what do I do, right? And it's kind of a sketchy area. These people live in these kind of like these tin huts, and I remember driving by the one house, not to sound like a privileged little white boy, but I remember seeing a bunch of guys that looked pretty rough. They're all standing in their yard shooting their pistols, and I was like, oh, geez. So it was kind of sketchy nonetheless. And what I ended up having to do, I remember there was a creek on the other side of the road, and then the neat part about the creek, I walked through a few of these, I remember there's these huge flat rocks. So I ended up pulling my my tire jack out of the trunk of my car. I jacked up the car, and I spent, gosh, it was, I don't know, hour and a half, 2 hours, digging these flat rocks out of the creek, building jacked up the car and built almost like a ridge that my tire would back out on. And I finally got out of there, but that was quite the experience. I remember halfway home I had to stop at a gas station and grab some Advil. It was ridiculous. But
yeah, I remember when you I remember when you texted me and you were telling me that story, and well, especially when you're doing a solo trip like that and you don't know the area, and all things being equal, you start hearing sounds of dueling banjos in the background, and you might think it's deliverance is going to happen, but it's all right.
Yeah. And I don't carry, because I'm a tough guy, right? I can handle it myself, but I don't know, maybe I'm not so tough. Maybe I need to start carrying for situations like that,
Well,
no, it was all good.
It was all good. You were able to figure it out.
I actually, when I was digging the car out, a lady drove by, and she was pretty rough looking. But I'm like, hey, you got anybody around here with a truck? And she's like, well, I'm actually headed up to the top of the hill to make a phone call. And that's a different way of life that none of us are used to. If they want to make a phone call, they have to drive to the top of the hill. But she was headed up to the hill to make a phone call. She's like, when I come back through, my husband's got an ATV. I'll have him come help you. And I'm like, oh, geez, an ATV is not going to help with any of this. But she was the nicest lady in the world. They're probably super down-to-earth, nice people. I'm not, I don't mean to make them sound bad. She was super nice, Yeah. And even just all the locals out there were super nice, way nicer than the Wisconsinites around here. Any house you drive by, they all wave. I mean, even the people shooting their pistols, they waved.
Yeah. Well, it's probably just more of the fact that you're in an area you're not familiar with. It's dark. You just walked 2.5 miles back off a ridge, and you dumped your car into a ditch. So, well, I promise if that's why you got to twist my arm. If we go out next time, we'll bring my truck, and then at least we'd have to really get deep into the ditch to get the truck stuck. So
yes, for sure. So then that night I got back to the hotel, and I remember, I think it was daylight savings time, and I started thinking, because I was beat down that night. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to sleep in the next morning, then I'm going to reevaluate and scout. And I remember I woke up early enough that I could get out there on time still to be out there before light. And I quit being a weakling or whatever, and I got up that next morning anyways, headed back out there to the exact same spot where I dropped the car in. And I'm like, I'm not going to let this spot beat me. And I remembered, so if you remember, the night before, I hunted a little bit closer to the vehicle, but when I had done all the scouting the night before, there was a spot where basically 3 ridges came together and made a knob. Mm-hmm. And you could, in the 3 ridges where the knob was, all the ridges kind of dropped down and made saddles, if you can picture that.
Yep.
So if you sit right on top of the knob, you've got all the deer that are coming down the ridges and doing whatever they might be doing cruising, and you've also got all those saddles where the deer are cutting over and going to hit the next ridge. And there was a lot of sign right there, so that just made a lot of sense to me. So that morning, I ran back to that spot, got in there, got set up. I wasn't super early. I think it was, by the time I was set up, you probably could shoot for 20 minutes already. But I sat there for a while, and I think I had 3 or 4 1.5-year-old bucks come by. A nice 2.5-year-old buck came by. And then at one point I looked up and I just saw a hell of a cage on one buck coming straight at me.
So to back up a little bit, I'm kind of still processing your setup. How did you identify that the 3 ridges came together and that those saddles were joining them? How big of an area are we talking? Is it like an acre?
You couldn't.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, if you sat, so I talk about a knob, and then the knob the knob kind of goes into three ridges in every direction. What would I describe it like? It is like the letter Y, right? But where all the lines intersect on the letter Y is a knob. It's higher.
Sure.
And you could, if you're sitting on that knob, you could almost shoot every little saddle on each side. Not quite. With the gun, you could cover it. It's less than 100 yards to every little saddle.
Okay. Yep.
I put myself in what I felt was the best sign. It was the best sign for the spot for the shot yardage and the wind and all that. Now, the one thing that kind of stunk, so these first 3 or 4 deer that came through, I talked about those prickly thorn things that were on the ground. Where I had walked, I pretty much just took a step off of that where I had walked and set up, and all these deer kept walking straight at me. Every single deer is walking straight at me, and then it clicked. I'm like, oh, these deer are walking where I walked because they don't want to walk through this nasty
prickly
pricker. Yeah, yep.
Yep.
And what I really should have done was pulled down and moved over a little bit, just moved back, got off that stuff because all these deer just kept nailing me in the tree. None of them got freaked out. They looked at me and then kind of walked off, a little edgy, but it wasn't the end of the world. But like I said, at one point I looked up and I saw this big one coming, and flipped on the camera, aimed it in his direction, and the big mistake I made was I was a little bit I was a little tired, right? A little bit wore down from the night before and everything. And usually I get into a tree and I kind of have my list of things that I run through to make sure they're all on point, make sure I'm not going to make a mistake. And one of the main things I always do is I say, I have an adjustable pin, and I say, where are most deer going to be? And I usually set up so that most deer are within 20 yards. I adjust my pin to 20 yards, and even if I forget, I'm usually good because that arrow doesn't drop or fly too high to the point where I'm gonna screw it up.
Right.
But I didn't run through that list of things in my head, and I had my pin still at 40 yards. So the deer ended up coming in.
And you had that set at 40 yards because the hunt on the previous night, you needed to have a little bit more range. Yep.
Exactly. Yep. So the deer came in, and one thing that I've been battling with is over the years, I've lost a lot of deer to that front-on shot. They come front-on, and I don't take the shot, and then in some way or another, the deer gets out of there without ever giving me a broadside shot. And I kept hearing about certain people, being able to make that shot and successfully kill the animal. And so I kind of dug into it a little bit deeper, and there's just a little pocket there that you have to be able to hit. You have to kind of have your wits about you to make it. And that deer came in, and he was facing straight at me. Or there was a little bit of angle on him, but just like every other deer that came in that morning, he looked up at me, and he the moment he stopped, I was going to drill him and stick it. I mean, right there's kind of that, like I said, that pocket between the shoulder and the neck.
Yep.
And when I shot him, the arrow sailed, like 2 feet higher or something like that. And I remember hearing a loud crack, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure I just shot that deer in the antler. And I got down, and there was a little tuft of hair. It hit him in the antler and kind of like shanked off his back a little bit. There was just a little bit of meat on the broadhead, but it didn't hurt him or anything. So that was what happened there. If I had my pin right, I think I would have stuck it right in the goods, and he would have ran a little ways, and that would have been it. That would have been it. Yeah, he was big. I mean, he was I want to say he was a 130 to 148 point, and for an 8 point, that's a hell of a frame.
Right. Well, I think one of the things that I'm learning from listening to this, and hope other people listening can learn, is that when you're doing one of these trips for the first time. Now, I know you'd been in Michigan and you just got done hunting in Wisconsin, but it's the whole mental process that you had to go through from being in an area that you're unfamiliar with, scouting it, hunting it, coming back and retreating, going through the different things in your head with, am I on the right sign? Am I hunting in the right location? That plays into the fact where you didn't go through your standard checklist, but now it's like that just made you better. That mistake is only going to make you better the next time you go into a situation like this, because when you start having that self-doubt, or you start thinking, well, this is a good enough spot, or it's okay, you're going to tell yourself, no, I've been here before, stick to the game plan, go through my checklist, make sure everything is set so you can execute. So even though you didn't have success in that particular case, it's going to make you 5 times better hunter because that scenario played out that way.
Exactly. Yep. And I remember, and like I said, I've done a few little out-of-state trips, and there's a point where you hunt for 2 or 3 days and you get frustrated, you say the hell with it, and you go home. And I remember the year before Dan and I went out to Minnesota and shot that buck in that swamp there, I remember listening to a podcast that Andy May did, and he was talking about his out-of-state trips, and he said that so many people get into the, like, day 2 or 3, and they're getting their tail up, they're missing. You legitimately just miss being home, right? You miss the comforts of home, the comforts of what you're used to, and you get out there and you get frustrated and you want to go home. And he said that's where most people fail, is they literally go home. And I was like, crap, that's what I'm doing. And he said, I remember him saying, you just got to stick with it, start bouncing around, keep moving, and you're going to get into the deer. The deer are there. It's just a matter of figuring out where they are. And it was, everybody has to hear things in a different way for it to click for them. And when he said it, I was like, shoot, that's exactly it. And I remember going to Minnesota with Dan, and it was like day 2 or 3, and we were getting our tails whooped, and I'm like, this just sucks. But I remember him saying, you got to stick with it. And Dan's like, let's go up and try these swamps. And we got up to the swamps, and pretty soon the first night we saw that, I was like a 2-year-old, and we were into the sign, and then it got good. So the biggest tip I would give people is there's going to be that point where you're just frustrated. You've had enough. You want to go home. I said I was going to sleep in that one morning, but then I woke up and I was like, the hell with that. I need to get out there. I didn't drive 8 hours here to sleep in a shitty hotel,
Right. You came out there to hunt, and you're going to use the time wisely. Well, in Minnesota, you had to deal with, day 3 of Dan not showering too.
Yeah. Eating those nasty cheese dogs that spoil on his dash. Yeah. Yeah, just stick with it. I mean, you're going to get your tail up, but stick with it. Because when you get home and you look back at the tail whooping that you got, it's rewarding to laugh about. It's fun to laugh about, and you want to go back and do it again. But then when you're back there doing it again, you're kind of like, man, why am I putting myself in this situation? And it's because there's a reward at the end of it. Just stick with it and grind hard.
Well, I agree. I think those situations that have some sort of that, I mean, maybe guys, guys like us that like to do this, we have kind of a warped sense of fun, but I think part of it is the challenge, both physically, mentally, and going into these different areas is what makes it fun. I mean, there's a sense of accomplishment when you go through and do that versus if it came easy,
Yep.
So
absolutely.
So all right, so you take the shot on this deer, your pin's set wrong, arrow sails over. So at that point, what's going through your mind?
Yep. So at that point, I was going to get back up there, and I actually sat that entire day and stayed up on those ridges. And I remember I was actually texting Andy May because he was kind of familiar with the area. And he's like, in my experience, he's like, I think it was like afternoon, he's like, you don't see anything. You hardly see anything. And I was like, okay, well, I'll sit all day and see what happens. Because obviously they're cruising. I saw all those different deer cruising that morning. And sure enough, there was a little bit of activity that night, 2 small deer moving around, but that was it. And I was like, okay, so if I'm going to hunt these mornings on these ridges, I'm just going to do mornings, and then I'm going to get down, scout, find something different, and keep doing that. And then at that
that's
point,
kind of one of those learning points, those patterns that until you experience it, you don't quite believe it until you experience it, right. And then you could use it to your advantage.
Right. Yep. And so at that point, that was the plan. And I think I was driving home that night driving back to the hotel that night from that sit. And Chris had from Elite Outdoors, he had actually just had a baby, just got back home. He's like, come on over. He's like, come over and have a beer or whatever. And I was like, oh, I don't want to bother you with the baby. And he's like, no, come on over. And I went over to his house, and he had all these giant deer. Gosh, he had like 170 incher that he shot the year before. He just had these slob deer, and that was, inspiring as heck to see. I was holding racks that we don't hold around here. It was pretty cool. But he's like, why don't you try and hunt a spot out by me? He's like, I got a piece of private or whatever that you can go on. And he's like, there was 170 incher out there in the beans the year before, and he was going through pictures of all these different deer that were in this. It was like a 20 or 15 acre woodlot. And I'm like, sure, I'll try something different. And I guess I would say that's a huge thing that was a learning factor for me too, because it's my initial the way I do things, I would have dove into that 15-acre or 20-acre woodlot and just kind of blew through it and seen what was in there. But he's like, no, he's like, you cannot do that. He's like, just sit on the edge of it. He's like, I can kind of tell you how the deer move into this woodlot from his experience. And that was what I ended up doing the next morning, was set up in a spot kind of where the deer come into that particular woodlot. It was just basically where a fence line ran into the woodlot. And got set up that morning, and I think I saw a doe way off in the distance, and it was just very different. It was a small woodlot and just wide, flat country, and I looked out and saw this buck coming running straight at me, and had to make a decision. It was like my second last day, and he wasn't huge. He was like a 120-inch buck or something like that, a 10-point or 11-point or whatever. And I was like, well, I've gotten my tail whooped. I was pretty excited as he was coming at me, so I'm like, I'm just gonna have fun with this and shoot this thing, and that was what ended up happening.
So the small woodlot with a fence line. So the fence line, obviously, did it have some tree cover on it? What
Yep.
was it cornfields? Was it beans, CRP? What sort of led up to the woodlot?
Yep, that particular woodlot was, or that particular field that I was over was beans. It was not picked beans.
Okay. So do you think those deer, I mean, obviously it was during the rut, so they were cruising across.
Yep.
I mean, that deer could have been cruising for you don't know how far, but
Right.
did Chris give you any indication as to where they might have been traversing or bedding? Were they bedding out in the fields in the other areas, or was there adjacent woodlots that they might have been cruising from?
See, I'm not real clear. There were adjacent woodlots, and I remember he said his buddy, this 170-inch buck he talked about, his buddy had seen it that same morning in another woodlot. I think it was less than a mile away. But what it sounds like is during the rut, they're kind of going from woodlot to woodlot to woodlot. He made it sound, if I'm remembering correctly, like during the rut, the real big boys sit pretty tight until last light, and that's when you catch them moving out of one woodlot or another. But I mean, it's a rut. You get a doe, you never know where they're going to run.
Right.
I mean, it's still the kind of terrain where I've got a lot to learn. I don't know everything about it. It was interesting because I remember walking up to it thinking, no way, this is going to be a long sit. I'm sitting here all day, and right away the first hour, this deer came running across the field.
So was that woodlot, was it elevated at all, or it was flat with
No.
bigger timber? No, it wasn't.
Just flat. Yep, just flat. You couldn't. The trees had these little branches on them. I don't know how to describe it. So the woods looked thick. You couldn't see right through the woods like a lot of our hardwoods is around here.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
was there?
Oh, go ahead.
Was there a lot of lowland cover in there, or was it fairly open in the?
Fairly open. I mean, other than those branches, it was fairly open. It was, from what I could see from my tree, it was fairly consistent too. Like we'll get hardwoods around here that might have a little knob on one end that's brushy, and that's where all the deer are held up. It wasn't like that. It was just a fairly consistent, perfectly rectangular woods.
So that'll make it tricky if deer are held up in there because they can see you from a vantage point of walking into it, and probably contributes to having to just hunt the fringes or the edges of those without pressuring them too much, especially in these situations.
Yep, that was what he said, yeah.
Interesting. Cool. So buck comes in. Did you actually shoot him? I forget from the video. Did you shoot him when he was coming right into the edge of the woodlot you were sitting in? Did you shoot him out in the field, or how did it? Yeah.
Yep. So he came. I actually had a perfect 20-25 broadside shot. I was going to shoot him. It would have been real simple. And just as I was easing into the trigger, he turned and faced straight at me and kind of walked a little closer to me. And then he was like 15 to 18 yards away, quartering to me pretty hard. And I was like, here we go with this quartering forward crap again. Yeah. And I'm like, well, I'll wait. He'll turn eventually. He wasn't buggy or anything. My wind was kind of cutting to him at a slight angle. And I'm like, I'll just wait and see what happens. And then he started doing that nose bob where they're trying to get some air in their nose. It almost seems like, get your scent a little bit. And I'm like, oh, shoot, he's going to bug out of here. All he's got to do is run out to the field. You see it where they run 20 or 30 yards, turn back and look, and he's too far. I can't shoot him. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try this quartering forward shot. And I settled the pin nicely right on his, right in that little gap, and squeezed the trigger. And he ran. I mean, it was like, I don't know, 30 or 40 yards, and just piled up. And I was just piled up. It was efficient. Yeah.
Yeah, my buck, I actually had that quartering towards me shot too as well. He was only 20 yards out at most, but I just had a little tiny window through the brush. And I had to make that same decision too because he was coming down a trail that ran perpendicular to me, and the wind was, it was that same scenario where if he would have gotten past me, he would have got into my windstream. So I
Yep.
I made a decision, and I actually, in that scenario, I lucked out because he piled past me at 100 miles an hour and ended up getting his rack caught in a vine that was probably 3.5 inches round that was right next to the swamp. And it took him up off his feet, and he flopped on the ground and died right there 20 yards from me.
That's
So,
awesome. I remember that.
because they,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
So that quartering forward shot too. It's so controversial. I remember messaging all you guys. I'm just gonna put this video out, but I was apprehensive about it because you're gonna get all the keyboard warriors fired up about it. But if you think about it, I guess the thing, and maybe you want to cut this part out of the podcast or leave it in or whatever. But if you think about it, you've got all these outdoor TV camera people saying, "Oh, don't take those shots. They're not showing those shots." Things of that sort. And in a way, that's a good thing because you don't want every single hunter out there taking those shots. I would personally not want the 12-year-old, much less the 16-year-old me taking that shot. But I've been in that tense moment so many times that I can calm myself down now. I can look at the situation and make quick decisions. So it's not for everyone, And if that kind of shot makes you uncomfortable, I wouldn't do it. I would say you're not ready for it yet. You
Right.
know, and just like any other shot, if you could shoot him broadside, hit him high, hit him low, hit him back, and screw it all up. I mean, you can still screw it up. It can still happen. But if you're not,
I think it's
I guess that's my rant.
right. No, and I think you're accurate. It's a shot where if you practice your arrow placement and you're confident in what you could do at certain ranges, then you have to think about in the moment, is that the right shot that you want to take for you? And I think you don't get 100% of the deer that you don't shoot at. I think Dan has talked about that before, and I've had some of the biggest deer that that I've had in front of me where I second guess the shot, and then I've got good footage of them walking away that I get to look at for the rest of my life. And that's fine. In the moment, you make those decisions, and I think the big thing is feeling good about the shot you took, and obviously you got it done, so it worked out well all the way around. And anyone who claims that they've never had a bad shot on a deer, I mean, I think they're probably lying because we've all had bad shots. If you've been any amount of, any sort of aggressiveness in any of the shots that you've taken, you've probably come up with a bad shot. Deer react to arrows different ways, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember too reading the YouTube comments, and a lot of people were like, "Oh, we appreciate the transparency. That's actually pretty cool. That's interesting how that worked." And that was pretty cool. There were a few trolls in the comments, and that's really all they were. But then, and I remember it was like a week or two later, the hunting public, Aaron, had a buck come in on him, quartering forward hard, and mind you, he was on the ground. I was in a tree, but he stuck it right up in that front area, and I don't remember if he shot the thing twice or what it was, but same thing, he had success with it. So it can be done.
Yeah, I remember that hunt, and I remember on the video, I think he was really concerned afterwards about where he had hit it. But he ended up killing the buck, but that was a big buck he shot off the ground. It was a pretty cool hunt.
Yeah, that was cool.
All right, so you get it done in Ohio, and now you're traveling back to Wisconsin, but you're still not satisfied, Joe. So what do you got left?
I got a pregnant wife at home, and I'm like, oh man, I gotta get this out of my system while I still have time. So so we had the gun season left, and the specific buck that there were two bucks that I was after. One of them I couldn't really get a beat on him, and the other one I had a lot of history with, the muzzleloader buck that I ended up killing. And I did a handful of bouncing around during the gun season, trying to figure out what he was up to. And I really hate to do too much bouncing around during the gun season because there's so many people around. And I know where a lot of these deer hold up when the pressure gets tight. And the last thing I want to do is go into one of these bedding areas, bump them out, and then you got the thing running past, 5 guys with shotguns and rifles. There's no way that deer's going to survive. And I've done that many times as a young guy. I get all excited, go tearing through the swamps or the thick stuff and bump deer for other people. So I was a little bit relaxed on that. I ended up getting sick and hardly hunted at the end of the gun season. And that actually worked out because if you remember our gun season, the numbers were really down because of the dates that the gun season landed. I remember, I don't get into all this stuff, but I remember Jeff Sturgis was saying something about that time period that it landed. It was like after the rut and the bucks were kind of, it was like a low point for getting bucks on their feet. And then when muzzleloader season actually happened, we were in the second rut, and I saw a lot more activity, a hell of a lot more.
Yeah,
activity.
there's that theory that right after peak rut, there's a little bit of a lull as the bucks start to feed more and rest more to try to recoup some of their energy,
Okay.
and then at least that's what I've read and heard about before. So yeah,
that makes sense. And that actually saved a lot of deer this year. I've never, I keep tabs on a lot of local deer and where they are and if they get killed, stuff like that, and I can usually figure out what happens to most of them. And there's a lot of deer that survived this past season because of that, which is pretty sweet. It should make for a good 2020 here. But so this specific buck that I ended up shooting with the muzzleloader, I knew what he did the previous year during the muzzleloader season, so I was going to play off of that a little bit. And I think it was like the second or third day of muzzleloader season. I took a week of vacation for muzzleloader season, and we had just got the snow, and I knew that this buck was living in the swamp from having trail cam pictures of him all season, and it was actually eating me up because I shot that bedded buck really early in the season. So I wanted to go chase this other one, but I didn't have a tag, so it was nice to be able to chase him in the swamp. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I had enough intel on the thing as to what he was doing when I had my tag in my pocket. But
so how many seasons had you known about this buck and kind of been after him and tracking his pattern?
Yep. So I got the first picture of him in it would have been 2017 as I think he was 2.5 years old. He always had a split G3 on his one side and just real short. His G2s were real short, so it made him real obvious. But I got a picture of him in the winter where I did end up killing him. And then that same winter, 2017, I got a picture of him in this other area where I thought I was going to kill him. I was getting pictures of him there. So he's kind of playing off of two different areas, I guess you could say. It was like 2 miles apart.
Right.
And then in 2018, I got some trail cam pictures of him, and I shined him. I got in the hunting beast video, you can see the footage of when I shined him. It was pretty neat footage. Looked really nice. And he was like he's like 130-inch buck then. He was with a doe during the rut. And anyways, I got some trail cam pictures of what he was doing as a 3-year-old during the muzzleloader season, and that was kind of what I was going to play off of for this year. I was going to work my way through and try and catch him coming back to bed one morning. And it was tough too because just like opening day gun season, the swamp was like a 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick. So it's where you stand there and then you pop through and then your shins get all banged up and everything. So
Yep.
It was pretty tough. I was going to work my way through. The deer were still actually going through that quite a bit. I was hearing them coming in, seeing them coming in.
And that was when you were accessing it in the morning. That's going to make it challenging because you can't get in there quiet when you're busting through all the time like that.
Right. So you just got to get in there really early and beat them even into the swamp, So that morning I did that, saw nothing, and then I immediately went out to the crop fields and I circled the entire swamp. I spent the whole day circling that entire swamp, trying to catch where a big set of tracks was cutting in. And then once I would find a big, and I knew he was really the only big one in the area. So if all I had to do was find a huge set, and I felt like I was in the game. And I circled that whole swamp, and I found one set of tracks that piqued my interest. It wasn't, sometimes you see a track and you're like, holy crap, that's a big white. It wasn't like that. But I'm like, well, if that's whatever this animal is, if that's what he's doing, that's how I'm going to set up. And so I wasn't going to hunt it at night. It wasn't a good the way it lays out, you just can't hunt it very well at night. I was going to leave it be. And it's heavily pressured stuff, so at night they just don't move much outside of their safe area, and there's no way with all that noise you're going to get in there. What's that?
Yeah, that makes sense, because earlier, like you had talked about that, when they're bedded in there in the evening, it's more difficult to get closer to them because they're in there in the bedding, or in the morning you're just trying to beat them back.
Yep, and they've been pressured for, I mean, September, October, November, and now we're into December. They've just been hammered on by people. Now, that buck was in that same swamp earlier in the season. That's a little different case because I feel like I could have quietly sloshed through the mud. He would have been a little bit more relaxed, traveling a little bit further, but at that time of the year, I just didn't feel like it was going to work at night. But so what I ended up doing, I went to the spot, and really wasn't intentionally, but I went to the spot where I got the trail cam picture of him as a 2-year-old. You know, that at the same time of the year. But I set up in this piece, set up over a field, and I was just sitting there. A bunch of does came out. I really didn't expect to see much. I was just kind of killing time, waiting, you know, for the next morning's hunt. And I remember these does were freaking out, and they didn't want to come past me. They knew I was there. And I looked in the back of the field, and I could see a heck of a buck in the back of the field. And I remember just staring, and I could see those short G2s, and I was like, what the heck? This thing is over here. I'm like, well, if this is how I'm going to kill him, this is how I'm going to kill him. And he actually pushed those does past me, or they wouldn't have gone past me. Usually, you know, those does would run back and take him with, but he actually pushed them past him, and he wanted to get out to that field, check out all the ladies. What was the date? It was like first week of December, so it was pretty cool to see, you know, at that time. And pretty simple, shouldered the gun, and when he got in front of me, shot him. Yeah.
So he was actually, now did he push those doe out of the bedding area you were in, or he was actually pushing the doe adjacent to the bedding area that you were hunting? So he never actually got to the bedding area?
No, so this was at night. So the does, when I killed him, it was at night. The does came out naturally like they normally do, and just feeding in the crop field. And then he must have been a little bit deeper into the bedding, and then he came out behind them. They had been out in the field. Like, what's that?
Yeah, I'm following now.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Sometimes I talk in circles and skip words, and it doesn't make sense. But
well, yeah, that could be me not understanding too.
I get all excited and I just skip words. People,
no, that's all right.
But yeah, so he pushed them past me coming out of the bedding that night.
Got it.
And it was funny too, because I had, where they came out of bedding, I had a trail camera where they came out, and I had him on that trail camera coming out. I mean, he was on the trail camera, and then I shot him 2 minutes later, and that trail camera had sat there for, I don't know, like a month, and I went through all the pictures, and not a single other time was he ever on that camera. So what I'm thinking is, it doesn't take much. You know, these deer will travel a mile or 2 miles or whatever at night to get out to the main food source, especially when it's cold like that. You know, you got good bedding in one area, and you got the standing cornfield a mile or 2 miles away. They're gonna travel if there's no good bedding in between. And it doesn't take much for deer from multiple bedding areas to all meet up in the same crop field at night, and then suddenly you've got a hot doe dragging non-local buck back to a whole different area. You know what I mean? That's my assumption, kind of, as to what happened. A hot doe drug him back that night. He went with her and came out where he wasn't supposed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was an sort of like an unplanned benefit of that doe being in the area, but also planning on being able to capitalize on the late rut that was happening as well.
Right. And that was another thing I've talked to Andy May about. Andy May kills a lot of his deer that way, where he'll see him do something. They'll be in an area for 2 or 3 days, repeatedly, year after year after year. And like I said, as a 2-year-old, he was there in that same field doing a similar thing. And so it's not something that the buck was unfamiliar with. It was probably something he didn't like to do as much for whatever reason. But that sometimes you watch for those little repetitive things that they do over and over year after year, and you can maybe capitalize on them.
Yeah, I've seen that, and you know, that conservancy property that we hunt, because we've been able to hunt it for several years now, and we've got some history just with trail cam photos, to be able to see how mature deer move through specific areas the same way every year. And a couple of the real mature ones, we're talking like, we've only had encounters with them in daylight. I mean, Dan had some encounters in daylight, maybe out of the last 7 years 2 times, but the rest of the travel time is all at night. And it's a lot of these photos are like 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., but we're kind of dealing with adjacent bedding areas and whatnot. But what's interesting is even though it's different mature deer, like 4 year plus deer, they're always showing up in these same areas during the same time of the year, traveling on the same corridors. So
Yep.
I
That's cool.
I do I do think there is something to the fact that when an animal when they do get older, they get almost like they want to stick tighter to their safe zone in some cases, and especially in an area where they feel comfortable. Um, I don't know. I know I've heard Dan say before that sometimes they can be easier to kill, and I've heard that before because if they're comfortable in their safe zone and they feel more protected in there, they tend to roam less. I don't know if there's a lot of science, a lot of data behind that from radio collaring certain bucks or mature animals to know how they move, but
They keep doing the same thing over and over, and it works for them. And suddenly they start getting sloppy, just like a criminal. Suddenly they get comfortable and they get sloppy and get caught.
yeah, I think they learn if they can learn a way to be safe and they do that over and over again, and if you can find a way to crack that code,
Yep.
I've heard of guys now, they'll hunt in groups, and if they can locate a bedding area and the access in and out of that bedding area, they'll group hunt it and kind of surround the trails going in and out of it, and then just
Yep.
stage hunt that. And
Yeah.
someone sees the deer, gets on the deer, and then they make a move on them.
Yep. And that's great too, because like if you're an individual guy and you're hitting one of the trails and the buck comes down a different trail, a lot of times when you walk out that night or when the buck comes back in the next morning, he figures out he was hunted and it's too late. So you're capitalizing on every potential way that buck can come out, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because a lot of times you only get that one chance, one or two chances to go in and hunt the deer.
Yep.
Rick,
So
go ahead.
one thing I've seen a few times. So we actually had a buck on this in the spot where I killed this muzzleloader buck. He lived there his whole life, got big, got mature. Gosh, I think he was like 5 years old or whatever. And suddenly he just disappeared. We had no idea where he went. He was on the cameras all the time, but he disappeared. And I literally thought he was dead. And then this other area where my muzzleloader buck had been living the whole time, a guy ended up shooting him in an obvious spot. Like if you were going to try and kill a doe, like a really obvious stupid doe, that's where you'd set up, and that's where this guy set up. And this buck was not familiar with how the pressure was in this particular area, and he came out, made a really stupid mistake. The guy shot him, and I've seen that time and time again. That it's like the pecking order gets adjusted. Like a bigger buck comes in, the dominance changes or something, and a buck gets relocated. And I've seen new bucks show up in certain areas, and they're so easy to kill, or they get killed really easily by somebody else or whatever, because they don't know how they're hunted in that particular spot. It's like when you get those homebody bucks, they're hard to kill because they've got seasons of seeing how you as a hunter move through the woods, and they get you figured out. I guess maybe I'm going off on a tangent, but I've seen it a few times, and it's kind of interesting.
No, I think it's a good point because it plays into two sides of it. It plays onto how us as hunters need to focus on learning an area, and not only just learning the topography and the terrain and how the wind moves across it, but also learning over year how the deer travel across it, because there's typically predominant patterns in how deer are going to travel across a piece of property, and there's reasons why that they do that. I mean, a mature buck might travel across a property because it's the most efficient way that they can check doe bedding during the rut, or they may access a property or leave a property because it's the safest way to get to a food source or exit a food source to get back to bedding. There is some reason why they're doing what they're doing, and if you add pressure to that in the form of human pressure or predators, then there's a safety reason why they're doing that. So you're looking at safety, you're looking at a food source, and you're looking at breeding. And I think all those
Yep.
things factor into it, but definitely
Absolutely.
a lot of those observation sits, or you mentioned a lot, the shining, if you're able to do that in the state that you're in, those looking at those summer patterns, just spending a lot of time studying how they move throughout these different properties, getting boots on the
Yep.
ground and looking at the actual sign that's telling you how they're moving through. Or like how you did out in Ohio where you threw a stand at a spot because you just wanted to see how they were moving through there. And in
Right.
that particular instance, it showed you not only how they were moving, but then verified during the times of the day that they were moving the most, even though you got a tip that they were just moving in the mornings.
Yep.
So
Yep. It was something. Basically, it was a tip on something I was told to pay attention to. And one of my greatest fears is all of the things that I don't pay attention to. Those things you don't pick up on. And I wonder would I have how many sits would it have taken me had somebody not said, "Hey, pay attention to this pattern happening." And there's so many things like that we all miss that you gotta pick up on that stuff. Try and get your brain to think like that, I guess is all I can say.
well, I think that's the advantage too of getting just listening to people's encounters and stories from
Yeah.
different hunts, different perspective. Part of the reason why I enjoy doing these and talking to people about their hunts is because I learn something every time. I think about what you do with your morning hunts, and there's a really a different tactic and perspective there, which that's kind of a take home that I got out of this talking to you
Right.
about these different hunts. But I think
Yep.
there's those little nuggets in everyone's encounters. And
Yep.
if you can listen to those or go online and read, if you're going on any one of the forums and try to learn that information, then apply it to your situation, you're going to start seeing these patterns. And
Right. Yep.
like I said,
And once you do it, it's the way you anticipate it and perceive it to be. Once you actually do it and accomplish it, it's always way different than what you perceived. So you really just have to get out there, take what you've learned, take what you've heard, but then look at the situation in front of you and use those tools and just go at it, and then pick up on things being different than what you perceive. Does that make sense? Because
yep,
I guess for the longest time, I would take, there were certain people that I followed, certain mentors, Dan being one of them, and I would take every single thing that they said for being complete gold. Like, this is exactly what's going to happen. And a lot of times they were right, but a lot of the times there were little terrain features or there were pressure in little spots that nothing fits into a perfect box. You have to look at your situation, and that's where there are some guys I see online, and they're taking the traditional this normally happens or that normally happens, and they're running with it, and they're not seeing success because of it. And I think you have to apply it to your situation and then go get messy and look at what's actually happening.
yeah,
Maybe I'm talking in circles, and I don't have a good way to explain it, but there was a point for me where I kind of had an aha moment where I'm like, I need to stop asking so many questions and start looking at things for myself and
yeah.
seeing them for what they're.
I think it's the difference between, so when you're learning all this stuff, when you're reading, when you're listening to other podcasts or watching videos or talking to other hunters, you're gathering information, you're studying, right? But then you
Yep.
have to go out in the field and you actually have to hunt and you have to learn that for yourself. Because when you learn it for yourself or you experience it for yourself, then it, it's so much more impactful than hearing it from someone else or learning it from another person. And then you start to see, because when someone explains a pattern or explains a technique or a tactic, just by way of how we tell our stories or teach stuff, they always have our perspective or our spin on it, and
Yep.
there's always variance. But then once you see one of those actually play out on a hunt, I mean, I would take a week straight of just being able to hunt like morning and night and travel around to a bunch of different locations and just try to make something happen or witness different types of patterns or deer movement because you learn so much throughout that solid block of time. And a lot of us with our, the lifestyles that we have, family and your work and everything, I think people are juggling all that. So they're getting these little windows of time to hunt, right? And they're trying to put everything together into that one hunt, and then it doesn't work out, and they get discouraged. I think,
Yep.
they got to try to put it in perspective. Learn as much as you can. Get out and scout those areas so you have this big log of areas you can potentially go to, and just experience for what it is. When you get out there, you
Yep.
put your best foot forward, but realize there's a million different scenarios of how it could play out. And if it doesn't work to your advantage, try to get out as fast as you can the next time as your schedule permits.
Yep.
And
Yep.
for the younger guys that have a lot more time, if they don't have a lot of commitment or whoever you are, I mean, take advantage of that. Even if you don't have as much experience or don't have as much knowledge in the tactics, if you're able to spend a lot of time out in the field, you're going to learn.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that was huge for me. A lot of my buddies spent a lot of time going to the bar, going to parties, chasing girls, and I never really, that was never a priority for me. And I've got so many more screw ups logged under my belt that
Right.
have now turned into lessons and have helped me that I'm grateful for, because I don't think I missed anything in the bars.
Right. And that's when you're.
one other.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to go a completely different direction. Kind of back to one thing you said. You talked about how we all kind of explain things differently. And one thing I've always thought about that I'll just say is I think we all explain things so differently, but I think the reason Dan, and there's a lot of killers out there like Dan that do well and have awesome walls, but I think one thing that makes Dan so special is the way he's able to explain things and break them down. And people can picture it in their mind, but he doesn't explain it in a way that is too he almost explains things objectively in a way that everybody can understand and they can apply to their situation. I think that's what makes Dan so special, is that he's able to communicate that better than 90% of the people in the industry. So I guess for any guy trying to learn something, that's where I started. That's great.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I had the huge advantage of being able to hunt with them in those for a time period where I was learning how to hunt bedding and what stage hunting meant. I mean, and then see that play out firsthand. That changed my whole mindset. So I would agree. I mean, and I know he's talked about this a lot, where it's just keeping an open mindset, right? You have to be able to shift what you're currently doing in order to adjust. And I think a situation like you, where you're going to 2 different states and then hunting 2 totally different types of land features and properties in the state of Wisconsin, and trying to figure out how you need to hunt those and how the deer are moving in those different areas, you have to have an open mind and you have to be able to adjust on the fly. And you have to, and you also got to be having fun with it. I mean, you can't.
Oh yeah.
Part of, like I said, I mean, if you get the time to spend 4 days solid hunting, or you're out of state, you get to do that, take advantage of it and have fun with it, because there's going to be a lot of lessons learned during that whole period. So
yeah,
I agree.
Absolutely.
So I guess what are you thinking about for next season, Joe? So what have you been doing this spring? We can talk a little bit about your spring scouting that you've done. I know you just had a baby, so I saw you had your wife and the baby out doing a little scouting with you.
Right. Yep. So just trying to get an inventory on what's alive so far and what I'll have next season. One buck I'm actually excited about. The same year that my muzzleloader popped up as a 2-year-old, there was also another buck in the area as a 2-year-old. He was high and tight. He was really, really neat looking. And I didn't have a tag at that point, so my dad actually chased him a little bit. I have some footage of him as a 2-year-old. And then as a 3-year-old, I don't know what happened with him. But then as a 4-year-old, I was talking to somebody earlier this year, and he's like, look at this buck I got pictures of over by me, and I instantly recognized it. So long story short, to kind of explain, this buck is all season. He's living in a refuge, comes out of the refuge a little bit onto this guy's property, but lives the whole season in this refuge. And then in the late season now, it's becoming a consistent thing. he's coming out and going to a place where I can kill him. And I think he's going to be I don't want to use the word easy, but I think he's going to be an easy deer to kill because he's so used to the safety and security of a refuge. I think he thinks like a refuge deer. And just from watching him over the last, you call it 2 or 3 years or whatever, just the way he travels is so simple. So I'm going to be really picky in 2020 and not shooting anything little because I kind of want to have a tag for late season if he shows back up. But
Sure.
it's kind of a risky thing to do, to run your tag right to the buzzer like that. And then, like, we had an extended season this year where January, you could hunt all January. So if we have that, that's cool. I guess a neat little story. This buck I had heard about, one of my big things in the area, I do a lot of, I guess you could say, networking with people. And I almost make deals with people, I guess you could say. But one of the local guys, I'll just use his first name, he'll get a kick out of it. He's a very active beast member, Todd. He told me about a buck that was cutting through, or he told me about this buck cutting through a certain piece on public land. And I was like, holy crap, that thing is back. And I threw up some trail cameras to try and figure out what trails he was running. So at the moment he shed, I could look for his antlers. And what I ended up doing is I put one of the cameras up, and I came back to check the camera a few days later. He wasn't on it. And then I came back a few days later, like I was checking it like every 2 days. So I think it was like 4 days later, I came back to check the camera, and laying in front of the camera off the side of this beat down trail in the snow was his antlers. So when I set up the camera, he had shed already. So I think it was like the middle of January this thing shed. So that's a whole nother issue where, if I wait for this deer to show up next year, I might have a 2-week window before he pops his antlers off.
Right.
So that's a whole nother deal too. But yeah, so now I appreciated Todd telling me about that, and because he told me that, I'm going to see if I can help him out a little bit next season, get him on to something out here.
Sure.
Sure. But I guess I've got a million different situations that I could sit and talk to you all night. Different things I'm going to try next year on different deer. The one that haunts me quite a bit is that buck that jumped up when I shot my bedded buck. I maybe have an idea on what he's doing if he's still alive. I reached out to a lot of people, showed people a lot of pictures, and nobody knew the buck. And usually I know a lot of people in my neighborhood, I guess you could say. I talk to a lot of these people, and usually if you get a picture of a buck, a neighbor has a picture of that same buck, and they'll tell you about it. But anyways, I think this...
That's a dandy buck.
Right?
That's a dandy buck.
Yeah.
That one is.
Yeah, he might... Oh, yeah, that's right. I did send you the pictures. Yeah, he's got like 100 and... I have a buck that's shaped exactly like him, so he's got like a 145-inch frame, but then on his right side, he's got a extra point in between his brow tine and his G2, and then his G3 forks off, and he's just got these dark chocolate antlers. Maybe someday I'll put up like an extra video on the YouTube channel, kind of like a unreleased footage clip or something like that, just because it's so cool.
Yeah.
But this buck might be living. There's an old guy, and I think that there's a chance. There's something good. It might be him living behind this old guy's house, right behind his house. So it's a pretty neat setup that I've been looking at, and there's definitely a good one hanging in there, and I'm thinking it might be him. So we'll see about that when the season comes. We'll kind of monitor that spot. I got the main buck. There's a buck that's been around in the area. He would be, I was trying to count today, he would be between 6 and 8 years old. I've got a bunch of his sheds, and I'm not 100% sure on if he's alive yet. He was during the middle of the season. But what I did this past season, there's a group of does that is hanging out, and I don't want to go into any details as to what the spot looks like, but there's a group of does that's hanging out in this weird little spot, and it's kind of a overlooked spot. And it just the way it lays out, it's so simple. And I put real early on back last, I think it was July, I put up a camera to kind of monitor the spot and what was going on. And these does were on the camera every single night consistently throughout the whole season, and we were going into I actually ended up getting one picture of the buck cruising through this spot. I think it was like early October. And the idea I had in my head was that if these does keep doing this over and over, the numbers of deer in this area are so low that once these does come into heat, this buck is going to be in here. And obviously by the time the rut came, he was not, or I didn't have a tag, so it was whatever. I was actually in Ohio when it happened. But I pulled my camera kind of after the rut, and he was on it. I think it was like 3 or 4 days in a row, in daylight, looping the downwind side of where those does are bedding, checking them. And so this year, one of the big plans is to, I don't know if I'm going to do the wireless camera or not. Those wireless cameras are kind of, sometimes it seems like they scare deer more than anything. I don't know. But I might put up the wireless camera, and the moment he shows up the first time, I'll just sit that spot like crazy. I'll sit it for 3 or 4 days straight, and eventually I think he'll loop through there, and I can get a crack at him. That's one of my more, it's something new I'm trying, I guess, but I really think I can make it work because of his consistency last year, and he did right what I thought he was going to do.
Well, I think in talking to you too and listening to you, the one thing that people can pick up on is, we said this earlier, but really study the layout of how these areas lay out, how are deer coming in and out of them. And then two, It seems like you combine that with getting a camera in place and then getting a sit in place. So you're kind of tying all the things together with how does the property lay out? What sign do I see there? Now get a camera in there to take an inventory of what is actually moving through there. And then let me get a sit in there to actually see, in the flesh what's moving through there and get a hunt. And then, of course, combining that with talking to the people in your area. You bring up a good point that a lot of us, when we hunt, it's kind of, we get into this pattern where we see something and we're worried about telling anyone about it. I think it's important that part of the enjoyment of hunting too is sharing stories and information, but you want to have trusted people that you can share that with. Yep. So like you said, it's a barter system. You give them some information about an area that they're doing, they give you some information back, and you guys work together. You work together so you're all successful. And I think that can be really enjoyable to do that, especially when you're, it's with close friends, because you can have a close friend get on a buck and be really successful, and then you could, they can return the favor for you.
Yep. Yeah.
So that's cool.
You're exactly correct. And even so, that high and tight buck in the late season, I did end up fighting both of his sheds, and like you say, all the local neighbors have probably seen those sheds, and they to be able to kill that buck, they kind of have to know what I know. So I really have no problem showing them the sheds. I mean, it'd be hard for them to screw it up for me, Sometimes it almost seems like the people that are the most secretive are the ones that really don't have anything to be secretive about. I don't know. Maybe I'm going off on a weird tangent there. I could get into a whole thing about communicating with other people on stuff like that. But
yeah, I mean, it is I think people get scared and they get protective. I mean, if you sort of go over the rabbit hole where you get really competitive with hunting a deer down, and I think the reality of it is it's all part of the mix and the game that we're playing. I mean, it's interesting once you start talking to people. You really find out how heavily pressured certain deer are. When all of a sudden you realize there's like 10 or 15 people that might have this deer on trail cam, or they're walking in that area, or they're scouting in that area, and then you start looking at the patterns of how those deer are moving through an area, or only moving a little bit in daylight, and you're like, wow, that deer is really smart, or really knows his bedding area or his travel corridor really well, because he's avoiding all these people that are constantly seeing it. So
exactly, and like that buck that I talked about, that I'd like to, these does keep coming through the spot, and I might throw up a wireless trail camera and catch him. The moment they come in to eat, I'd like to catch them that way. There's a crap load of people hunting in there, and I was actually getting them on trail camera quite a bit, all these different people, and it was interesting to see how some people were getting down out of the tree before the last 20 minutes of closing time. But the thing that I thought was interesting, so what it really comes down to is it's all about those does in there. And I figured out where those does are laying, and those does are really using their eyes and watching the hunters come in. So there's the way I would get in there to kill them. I have to slide through some cover, kind of in a weird way, and slide up the backside of a tree. Like it's really a beast style hunt, I guess you could say, to get in there. Well, your average guy is going in there. Those does knows that the does know that the person is there. They see the person climb the tree, and they never come out. So it's really kind of interesting. There's just a crap load of people that the deer have figured out, and I'm hoping to be the one guy that can kind of throw a rock in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
But,
I think we're just about at the 2-hour mark, so I think we filled up a good podcast. But
sounds good.
Well, thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. And
yeah, absolutely.
This will be a
appreciate
good
all you
one.
guys. Appreciate all that you guys have done for me, and I hope you guys can get on the good ones next year as well. We got to get Dan. Boy, I think Dan ate his first tag in a long time, so he's due for something big here in 2020.
Yeah, he had a lot of good encounters, was onto a lot of nice bucks, and just didn't swing his way this year. But yeah, better things to come. Next year will be fun too. We'll get some good stories in, and
yeah,
you got to twist my arm to get out of the state or go roam around a little bit more. Not let work tie me up so much.
Yeah, you only live once, right?
Yeah. All right, sounds good.
Sounds good.
I'll
take care.
We'll see you, Joe.
Yep.
That concludes today's podcast episode. Please go to thehuntingbeast.com to post any discussions, questions, or comments regarding today's podcast episode.